Hi, this is Grandma Rhonda Reads, and today I'm going to read a fairy tale called Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. Once upon a time, there lived a young farmer's wife who longed to have a little child of her own. So she went to a wise old woman and said to her, "I wish so very much to have a child, a little tiny child. Won't you give me one, old mother?" "Oh, with all my heart," replied the old woman. "Here is a barley corn for you. It is not exactly the same sort as those that grow on the farmer's fields, or that are given to fowls in the poultry yard. But sow it in a flower pot, and then you shall see what you shall see." Thank you," cried the young wife, and she gave the old woman a silver coin. Then she returned home and sowed the barley corn as she had been directed, whereupon a large and beautiful flower immediately shot up from the flower pot. It looked like a tulip, but the petals were tightly folded up. It was still a bud. "What a lovely flower!" exclaimed the peasant woman, and she kissed the pretty red and yellow leaves, and as she kissed them, the flower made a loud sound and opened. It was indeed a tulip, but on the small green center of the flower there sat a little tiny girl, so pretty and delicate, but her whole body was scarcely bigger than the young wife's thumb. So she called her Thumbelina. A pretty varnished walnut shell was given Thumbelina as a cradle. Blue violet leaves served as her mattresses, and a rose leaf was her cover. There she slept at night, but in the daytime she played on the table. The peasant wife had filled a plate with water and laid flowers in it. Their blossoms bordered the edge of the plate, while the stalks lay in the water. On the surface floated a large tulip leaf, and on it Thumbelina could sit and sail from one side of the plate to the other. 2 white horsehairs were given her for oars. They looked so charming, and Thumbelina could sing too, and she sang in such low, sweet notes as never were heard before. One night, while she was laying in her pretty bed, a great ugly toad came hopping in through the broken window pane. The toad was such a big creature, old and withered looking, and wet too. She hopped at once down upon the table where Thumbelina lay sleeping under the red rose petal. "That is just the wife for my son," said the toad, and she seized hold of the walnut shell with Thumbelina in it and hopped away with her through the broken window pane down into the garden. In the garden was a broad stream. Its banks were muddy and swampy, and in the midst of this mud, the old toad and her son lived. Ugh, how hideous and deformed he was, just like his mother. "Awk, awk," was all he could say when he saw the pretty little maiden in the walnut shell. "Don't make such a riot or you'll wake her," said the mother. "She might easily run away from us, for she's as light as a swan down feather. I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll take her out into the brook and set her down on one of the large water lily leaves. It will be like an island to her because she's so light and small. Then she cannot run away from us, and we can go and get ready the rooms down under the mud where you and she are to dwell together." Out in the brook there grew many water lilies with their broad green leaves, each of which seemed to be floating over the water. The leaf which was the farthest away from the shore was also the largest. So the old mother toad swam to it, and on it she set the walnut shell with Thumbelina. Poor little Thumbelina awoke quite early the next morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry most bitterly, for there was nothing but water on all sides of the large green leaf, and there was no way she could reach the land. Old Mother Toad was down in the mud decorating her apartments with bulrushes and yellow flowers. so as to make it quite pretty and tidy to receive her new daughter-in-law. At last she and her frightful son swam together to the leaf where she had left Thumbelina. They wanted to fetch her pretty cradle and place it for her in the bridal chamber before Thumbelina was brought down into it. Old Mother Toad bowed low in the water and said to Thumbelina, "Here's my son. He is to be your husband, and you will dwell together so comfortably down in the mud." "Walk, walk," was all her son could say. Then they took Thumbelina's neat little bed and swam away with it, while Thumbelina sat alone on the green leaf, crying. She did not like the thought of living with the withered old toad and having her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes that were swimming to and fro in the water beneath her heard what the mother toad had said, so they now popped up their heads and wanted to see the little girl. When they saw her, they were charmed with her delicate beauty, and it upset them very much that the hideous old toad would carry her off. No, that should never be. The fish surrounded the green stalk in the water where the water lily leaf rested and gnawed on it underneath with their teeth, and the leaf floated away down the brook and Thumbelina on it, away, far away where the old toad could not follow. Thumbelina sailed past so many places, and the wild birds along the bushes saw her and sang, "Oh, what a sweet little maiden!" On and on, further and further floated the leaf. Thumbelina traveled very far. A pretty little white butterfly kept fluttering round and round Thumbelina, and at last it sat down on the leaf, for the butterfly loved Thumbelina so much, and Thumbelina was so pleased. There was nothing to trouble her now that she had no fear of the old toad pursuing her, and wherever she sailed, everything was so beautiful. The sun shone down on the water, making it bright as liquid gold, and now Thumbelina took off her sash and tied one end of it round the butterfly, fastening the other end firmly onto the leaf. On floated the leaf faster and faster, and Thumbelina with it. Presently, a large flying beetle came buzzing past. He caught sight of Thumbelina and immediately fastened his claw around her slender waist, flew up into a tree with her, but the green leaf still floated down the brook and the butterfly with it, because he was tied to the leaf and could not get loose. Oh, how terrified was poor Thumbelina when the beetle carried her up into the tree. And how sorry she felt, too, for the darling white butterfly which she had left tied fast to the leaf. She feared that if the butterfly could not get away, he would perish of hunger. But the beetle cared nothing about that. He sat with her upon the largest leaf in the tree, gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and hummed her praises, telling her she was very pretty, although she was not at all like a beetle. And by, all the beetles who lived in that tree came to pay her a visit. They looked at Thumbelina, and one Miss Hen Beetle drew in her feelers, saying, "She has only 2 legs. How miserable that looks." "She has no feelers," cried another. "And see how thin and lean her waist is. Why, she's just like a human being." "And how very, very ugly she is at last," cried all the lady beetles in chorus. The one beetle who had carried Thumbelina off still could not persuade himself that she was other than pretty. But since all the rest of the beetles kept repeating and insisting that she was ugly, he at last began to think they must be right, and determined to have nothing more to do with her. She could go wherever she wished for all he cared, he said. And so the whole swarm of beetles flew down from the tree with Thumbelina and sat her on a daisy. Then she cried and cried because she was so ugly that the lady beetles would not keep company with her. And yet Thumbelina was the prettiest little creature that could be imagined, soft and delicate and transparent as the loveliest rose. All summer long, Thumbelina lived alone in the wide woods. She wove herself a bed of grass and straw and hung it under a large leaf which sheltered her from the rain. She dined off the honey from the flowers and drank from the dew that every morning sprinkled the leaves and herbs around her. Thus passed the summer and autumn, but then came winter, the cold, long winter. All the birds who had sung so sweetly to her flew away. Trees and flowers withered. The large leaf under which Thumbelina lived rolled itself up and became a dry yellow stalk. And Thumbelina was fearfully cold, for her clothes were wearing out, and she herself was so small and frail. The poor little thing, she was nearly frozen to death. It began to snow, and every light flake that fell upon her made her feel as if a whole shovelful of snow would be thrown upon us. For we are giants in comparison with the little creature only an inch long. She wrapped herself in a withered leaf, but it gave her no warmth. She shuddered with the cold. Close outside the woods, on the edge of which Thumbelina had been living, lay a large cornfield. But the corn had been carried away long ago, leaving only the dry, naked stubble standing up from the hard, frozen earth. It was like another woods to Thumbelina, and oh, how she shivered with cold as she made her way through. At last, she came past the field mouse's house, for the field mouse had made herself a little hole under the stubble, and there the mouse dwelled snugly and comfortably, having a room full of corn and a neat kitchen and a store chamber besides. And poor Thumbelina must now stand at the door and beg for a little piece of corn, for she had had nothing to eat during 2 whole days. "You poor little thing," said the field mouse, who was indeed very good-natured. "Come into my warm room and dine with me." And as the mouse soon took a great liking to Thumbelina, she asked her to stay. "You may stay with me all the winter if you will." And as the mouse soon took a great liking to Thumbelina, the mouse asked Thumbelina to stay. "You can stay with me all the winter if you want, but keep your room neat and clean, and tell me stories, for I love stories dearly." And Thumbelina did all that the kind old field mouse required of her, and she was very comfortable in her new abode. "We shall have a visitor presently," observed the field mouse. "My next-door neighbor comes to see me once every week. He is better off than I. He has large rooms in his house and wears a coat of just beautiful black velvet. It would be a wonderful thing for you if you could secure him for your husband. But unfortunately, he's blind, so he cannot see you. You must tell him the pretty stories you know." Well, Thumbelina did not care at all about pleasing their neighbor, Mr. Mole, nor did she wish to marry him. He came and paid a visit in his black velvet suit. He was so rich and so learned, and the field mouse declared his domestic home was 20 times larger than hers. But the sun and pretty flowers he could not stand. Thumbelina was called to sing for his amusement, and by the time she had sung, Lady bird, fly away home," and the Friar of Orders Gray, the mole had quite fallen in love with her through the charm of her sweet voice. However, he said nothing. He was such a prudent and cautious animal. He had just been digging a long passage through the earth from their house to his, and he now gave permission to the field mouse and Thumbelina to walk in it as often as they liked. "However," he told them, "do not be afraid of the dead bird that lays in the passage." It was a whole bird, with beak and feathers entirely covering it, and therefore he supposed it must have died at the beginning of winter, and had been buried just in the place where the mole had dug his passage. The mole took a piece of tinder, which shines like fire in the dark, put it in his mouth, and went on first to light his friends through the long, dark passage. When they came to the place where the dead bird lay, he thrust his broad nose up against the ceiling and pushed up the earth so as to make a great hole for the light to come through. In the midst of the floor lay a swallow, his wings clinging firmly to his sides, his head and legs drawn under his feathers. The poor bird had evidently died of cold. Thumbelina felt so very sorry for the bird, for she loved all the little birds, those who sung and chirped so merrily to her the whole summer long. But the mole kicked it with his short legs, saying, "There's a fine end to all its whistling. A miserable thing it must be to be born a bird. None of my children will be birds. Such creatures have nothing but their feathers and must starve to death in the winter." The field mouse cleared her throat. Yes, indeed, a sensible animal like you may well say so. But what has the bird got for all his chirping and chirping? When winter comes, it might starve and freeze, and it's such a large creature, too. Thumbelina said nothing. But when the mouse and the mole had turned their backs upon the bird, she bent over it, smoothed down the feathers, covered its head, and kissed the closed eyes. Thumbelina said, "Perhaps this was the bird that sang so delightfully to me in the summertime," she thought. "How much pleasure it had given me, this dear, dear bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight had come, and then followed the ladies home. But Thumbelina could not sleep that night, so she got out of her bed and wove a carpet out of hay, and then went out and spread it round the dead bird. She also fetched some soft cotton from the field mouse's room, and she laid the cotton over the bird that it might be warm amid the cold earth. "Farewell, dear bird," said Thumbelina. "Farewell, and thanks for your beautiful song in the summertime, when all the trees were green and the sun shone so warmly upon us." And Thumbelina pressed her head against the bird's breast, but was terrified to feel something beating within it. It was the bird's heart. The bird was not dead. It lay in a deep sleep, and now that it was warmer, its life returned. Every autumn, all the swallows fly away to warm countries, but if one of them lingers behind, it freezes and falls down as though dead, and the cold snow covers it. Thumbelina trembled with fright, for the bird was very large compared with her, who was only an inch long. However, she took courage and laid the cotton more closely round the poor swallow, and fetched a leaf that had served her as a cover, and spread it over the bird's head. The next night Thumbelina stole out again and found that the bird's life had quite returned, though it was so weak that only for one short moment could it open its eyes to look at Thumbelina. Thumbelina stood there with a tinder in her hand. She had no other lantern. The little swallow said, "Thanks to you, thou sweet little child. I feel delightfully warm now. Soon I will recover my strength and be able to fly again out in the warm sunshine." "Oh, no," Thumbelina replied. "It's too cold outside. It snowed and it's freezing. You must stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Thumbelina brought the swallow water in a flower petal, and he drank it. And then he told her how he had torn one of his wings in a thorn bush and therefore could not fly fast enough to keep up with the other swallows, all of whom were migrating to the warm countries. He had at last fallen to the earth, and more than that, he could not remember. He did not know at all how he had gotten underground. However, underground he remained all winter long, and Thumbelina was kind to him and loved him dearly, but she never said a word about him either to the mole or the field mouse, for she knew they would not put up with the poor swallow. As soon as spring came and the sun's warmth penetrated the earth, the swallow said farewell to Thumbelina, and she opened for him the covering of earth which the mole had thrown back on before. The sun shone in upon them so deliciously, and the swallow asked whether Thumbelina would go with him. She might sit upon his back, and then they could fly together far out into the green woods. But Thumbelina knew it would upset the old field mouse if she were to leave her. "No, I cannot. I must not go," said Thumbelina. "Fare thee well, then, "Thou good and pretty maiden," said the swallow, and away flew into the sunshine. Thumbelina looked after him, and tears came into her eyes, for she loved the swallow so much. "Tweet, tweet," the bird sang as he flew into the greenwood. And Thumbelina was now sad indeed. She was not allowed to go out into the warm sunshine. The wheat that had been sown in the field above the field mouse's house grew up so high that it seemed a perfect forest to the poor little girl, who was only an inch tall. The field mouse told her, "This summer you must work at getting your wedding clothes ready." For their neighbor, the blind, dull mole in the black velvet suit, had now proposed to Thumbelina. "You shall have wool and linen in plenty. You will be well provided for with all manner of clothes and furniture before you become the mole's wife," the mouse said. So Thumbelina was obliged to work hard at the spindle, winding up thread, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to spin and weave night and day. Every evening the mole came and always began to talk about the summer soon coming to an end, and that then, when the sun would no longer shine so warmly and the earth was as dry as a stone, yes, then his wedding with Thumbelina would take place. But this sort of conversation did not please Thumbelina at all. She was thoroughly wearied of his dullness and his tedious and foolish talk. Every morning when the sun rose and every evening when it set, she used to steal out, and she went out the door, and when the wind blew the tops of the corn aside, she could see the blue sky through the opening. Thumbelina thought how bright and beautiful it was outside, and wished most fervently to see the dear swallow once more. But he never came. He must be flying far away in the beautiful green woods. Autumn came, and Thumbelina's wedding clothes were ready. 4 weeks more, and you shall be married," said the field mouse. But Thumbelina cried and said she would not marry the dull mole. "Fiddlesticks!" exclaimed the field mouse. "Don't be obstinate, child, or I shall bite thee with my white teeth. Is he not handsome? Why, the queen has not such a black velvet dress as he wears. And isn't he rich? Rich in both kitchens and cellars. Be thankful to get such a husband." So Thumbelina must be married. The day picked to marry had arrived. The mole had already come to fetch his bride, and she must dwell with him deep under the earth, never again to come out into the warm sunshine which she loved so much and which he could not stand. The poor child was so desperate at the thought that she might have to bid farewell to the beautiful sun. She at least had a chance to glimpse the sun every now and then when she lived with the field mouse. But down under the ground? "Farewell, glorious sun," she cried, throwing her arms up into the air, and she walked a little way beyond the field mouse's door. The corn was already harvested, and only the dry stubble surrounded her. "Farewell, farewell," she repeated, as she clasped her tiny arms around a little red flower that grew there. "Say hello to the dear swallow for me if you should see him again." Chirp, chirp! There was a fluttering of wings just over her head, and she looked up, and behold, the little swallow was flying past. And how pleased he was when he saw Thumbelina. She told him how she had been obliged to accept the disagreeable mole as a husband, and that she would have to dwell deep underground when the sun never came near. And Thumbelina could not stop crying as she told the swallow. The swallow said, "The cold winter will soon be here. I shall fly far away to the warm countries. Will you go with me? You can sit on my back and tie yourself firmly to me with your sash, and we will fly away from the stupid mole in his dark room, far away over the mountains to those countries where the sun shines so brightly, where it's always summer, and the flowers bloom all year round. Come and fly with me, sweet little Thumbelina. You saved my life when I lay frozen in the deep dark of the earth." "Yes," said Thumbelina, "I will go with you." And she seated herself on the bird's back, her feet resting on its wings, and she tied her sash firmly round his feathers. "Yes, I will go with you," said Thumbelina. And she seated herself on the bird's back, her feet resting on the outspread wings, and tied her sash firmly round one of the strongest feathers. And then the swallow soared high into the air and flew away over the forest and over the lake, over the mountains whose crests were covered with snow all year round. How Thumbelina shivered as she breathed the clean, frosty air. However, she soon crept down underneath the bird's warm feathers, her head still peering forth, eager to behold all the glory and beauty beneath her. At last they reached the warm countries. There the sun shone far more brightly than in her native home. The heavens seemed twice as high and twice as blue, and ranged along the sloping hills grew the loveliest green and purple grapes. Oranges and melons were seen in the groves. The fragrance of myrtles and balsams filled the air. And by the way, groups of pretty, merry children ran and jumped about playfully, chasing large, bright-winged butterflies. But the swallow did not stop there. Still he flew on, and still the scene seemed to grow more and more beautiful. Near a calm blue lake, overhung by lofty trees, stood a half-ruined palace of white marble. It had been built in times long ago. Vines and wreaths trailed up the long, slender pillars, and on the pillars, among the green leaves and waving vines, many a swallow had built his nest, and one of these nests belonged to the swallow on whose back Thumbelina was riding. "This is my house," said the swallow, "and if you would rather choose for yourself one of the splendid flowers growing beneath us, I will take you there, and you can make your home in the loveliest flower of all." "That would be charming," cried Thumbelina, clapping her tiny hands. On the green grass beneath them lay the fragments of a white marble column which had fallen to the ground, and around the column twined some beautiful, large white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and set her on one of the broad petals. But what was her surprise when she saw sitting in the very heart of the flower a little man, fair and transparent, almost golden color. He was wearing the prettiest gold crown on his head, and he had the brightest, most delicate wings on his back, and he was scarcely 1 inch larger than Thumbelina herself. He was the spirit of the flower. In every blossom there lived one such fairy, and this one was the king of all of the flower fairies. "Oh, how handsome he is, this king," whispered Thumbelina to the swallow. The fairy prince was quite startled at the sudden descent of the swallow, who was sort of a giant compared to him. But when he saw Thumbelina, he was delighted, for she was the very loveliest maiden he had ever seen. So he took his gold crown off his own head and sat it on hers. He asked her name and whether she would be his bride and reign as queen over all of the fairies. This, you see, was quite a different bridegroom from the son of the ugly old toad or the blind mole with his black velvet coat. So Thumbelina said yes to the beautiful prince. And then the lady and gentleman fairies came out, each from a separate flower, and they met her and greeted her, and gracefully and courteously they paid her homage, and every one of them brought her a present. But the best of all presents was a pair of transparent wings. They were fastened on Thumbelina's shoulders and enabled her to fly from flower to flower. That was the greatest of pleasures, and the little swallow sat in his nest above and sang to her his sweetest song. In his heart, however, he was very sad, for he loved Thumbelina and would have wished never to part from her. The king of the fairies said to her, "You shall no longer be called Thumbelina, for it's not a pretty name, and you are so lovely. We will call you Maya." "Farewell, farewell," sang the swallow, and away he flew from the warm countries, far away back to Denmark. There the swallow had a little nest just under the window of the man who writes stories for children. "Chirp, chirp, chirp," the swallow sang to the writer from whom we learned this story. The end. Thank you guys for spending your time with me while we read this fairy tale together. Goodbye, good night, sweet dreams.